Hello.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar/Zoom meeting, Fundraising Essentials, What You Need to Know Before You Begin with Paul Olivett. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dan Hendy. I'm the Education Manager with the Pennsylvania Rec and Park Society. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping points, please. First of all, this presentation is being recorded. Participants are muted to begin the presentation. However, you will have the ability to unmute yourself to participate during the presentation. Please remain muted when not speaking to minimize background noise. You can submit your questions or comments in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will either address them during the webinar or at the end. In a few days, I'm going to admit some more people here.
Okay.
In a few days, you will receive a link to the recorded presentation via the email. This presentation has been approved for 0.1 CEU or 1 contact hour. At the end, a poll with 5 questions will appear on your screen. Please answer these questions, and those with 4 or more correct answers will receive email notification of credit earned. Make sure you take the quiz immediately following the presentation. If you do not wish CEU credits, you don't have to take the poll. A little background on who we are. The Pennsylvania Rec and Park Society is the principal statewide association providing professional development, advocacy, and resources for those working and volunteering in the parks and recreation field. We provide our members with industry news, research and trends, legislative advocacy, technical assistance, current resources, and many professional development opportunities and networking events throughout the year. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Paul Olivett is the Executive Director of the State College Area Education Foundation. He's got 25 years of experience as a professional fundraiser and has worked in many sectors, including higher education, nonprofits, and service organizations. Paul specializes in working with small nonprofit organizations and understands the challenges associated with taking the first step in developing a successful program or campaign. And so now it's time for me to hand things over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'll share my screen here in a second. Oh, hold on, dummy. There we go. Can you all see that? Can you see that, Dan?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate you taking some time to spend with us. A couple of caveats up front. When Dan and I first started talking about this about 6 months ago, the world was a much different place. But everything I talk about today is still relevant. We'll talk a little bit about how to deal with fundraising given today's atmosphere, but the message is that you shouldn't really let it impact you. But part of what I wanted to talk about today was kind of how you get started with a fundraising program and some key things to do. And I realized that, you are all in different spots in terms of, where you are in your fundraising program, if at all. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of different areas. But again, the basics still apply. And depending on where you are, you can kind of insert yourself into what I'm talking about today. So just again, a little bit about me. Like Dan said, I've been doing fundraising professionally for 25 or so years. Got my start with the American Red Cross, the local chapter in Lancaster, many, many years ago. Came up here to State College to work for Penn State and left Penn State a little bit after that. Spent about 6 or 7 years with them and sort of somewhat naturally got into working with smallish organizations. I suppose I have a little entrepreneurial spirit in me, and I kind of like working with startup/smallish organizations. Just more fun, more interesting, more flexible than some of the bigger places. I have actually a fair amount of connection to Parks and Rec. I grew up in upstate New York, and like every little town in New York, we had our little Parks and Rec program. So from the time I was 6 or 7 years old until I was 16, I would go to the program every day, or during the summer. We did swimming lessons in the beginning, which wasn't fun in upstate New York when it was cold. And then when I was 16, I actually was a counselor. So I spent 3 years as a counselor. So I'm, from my youth, fairly intimately understanding of Parks and Rec. And then actually when we moved here with my kids, I got to know Jeff Hall. I'm sure a lot of you know Jeff. Jeff runs the programs here in Center Region. And our kids were involved. My daughter played softball. I did a little baseball thing with Jeff one time for young kids. And then we actually did the track stuff too. Both my kids are involved in track. So we got to do the stuff here at Penn State. And that was really a lot of fun. Actually, sad to see that program go, but really enjoyed that. And obviously, as a person who's been around sports my whole life, I'm very supportive of doing things actively. And obviously, Parks and Rec is a big part of that. I would strongly encourage you to ask questions. I am not that interesting for 45 minutes, so it's much more fun if I can respond to questions as you have them. Like Dan said, you can go in the chat room or raise your hand. Normally, I would do this in front of people. It's obviously easier to engage people that way, but obviously we're all in the Zoom world now and still getting comfortable with it. But I encourage you, as I'm talking, if something comes up that you want to be clarified or you have a specific question about, don't hesitate to do that. I'll give some time for questions at the end too. So you have a chance then too. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about, kind of the objectives of what we want to get through today. I always joke about, people who aren't in fundraising think there's a lot of mystery to it. So I always make this joke at the beginning about uncovering the mysteries, but the hint, there really are no mysteries to fundraising. It's really, like I say a lot of times, it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. But there are certain steps that you want to do, regardless of where you are in the process, that are really, really important to building the foundation of fundraising. And if you skip over some of those, which a lot of organizations do, you're going to find yourself in some trouble. So I would encourage you to not be afraid of it. Hopefully a lot of you are already doing some of it, but to really think about some of these important steps. And one of the things that I always talk to groups about, and I try to do in the work I do, is really have a very strong communications outreach program. It's really important to get your message out there. Hopefully, you're already doing some of that, but part of what you guys do is already in the community, but it's still important to tell that story. So you want to have, and I'll talk more about some of the specifics of how to do that, but that is really probably the most important first step of any fundraising program, is to begin with a strong communications program. We'll talk a little bit about an annual giving program and how you might manage that. A few things that you can think about, whether you're doing one now or you're thinking about doing some sort of annual giving work. We'll talk a little bit about how to get some of those initial things rolling there. And then talk a little bit about how you get prepped for a capital campaign. And again, all these things kind of go in an order. As I have said and will continue to say, you can skip some of these steps if you want, but it really makes it much harder to have a successful effort if you're going to jump in the middle of this and try to get something done. And again, one of my main messages to groups, particularly smallish groups, because I've worked with them so much, is just to always try to be as realistic as possible about your expectations. Both the amount of time that you have to spend to prepare and the amount of money that you're going to raise. The theme I've dealt with over the years is just organizations that have way too optimistic expectations about the kind of money they can raise. And again, we're going to talk about some things that you can do to understand what you can and can't do. But I would just encourage you all, as you're thinking through whatever fundraising you're doing, just try to be as data-driven as possible and try to collect as much data and information from people as you can before you get going, so that you can make sure, because again, ultimately the objective of all fundraising is to be successful. But the important thing to understand is that you can define your success based on what the data is showing you. It's much better to incorporate that in than to just jump out there and say, we want to raise $1 million without really understanding where that's going to come from. Okay, so just some philosophies that I talk to groups a lot about, and again, there's no great shakes here, but again, there's no magic to anything in fundraising. One of the things I see a lot of groups do, even sophisticated high-level operations, they spend a lot of time trying to find that perfect mission statement or that perfect program, and spend a lot of time wordsmithing communications, and that's fine. You want to be cautious and careful and make sure things are compelling, but that's not really going to provide any magic for your fundraising program. Fundraising is very comparable from my perspective to sales. And a lot of sales is just a numbers game. You have to ask a certain number of people, and that number, and it's usually a big number of people, and a certain number of those people will give. If you try to cheat that system, it's going to be much harder to try to be successful and to raise money. So I would encourage you just to think about it in those terms, as opposed to trying to find the one magic answer to this. I always talk to groups about really trying to personalize every story that they tell, particularly as it comes to your communications program. The more you can talk about individual families, individual kids, as opposed to saying, we had 55 kids involved in this program. Tell a story about a couple of kids that were involved and what they did and how they did it. And because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to create emotion in your prospective donors. And you want to get them to put them in that position. And hopefully, given the work you all do, there's a lot of people that have been involved in the programs that you offer and believe already in the mission of Parks and Rec. So you want to make sure that you illustrate to that then, whether it's parents or grandparents or whoever it happens to be. Telling those personalized stories really allows people to see themselves as supporting your organization. Also keep in mind, fundraising is very, very competitive, particularly in a time like this, where there are lots of groups now that are going to be asking for money in what might be sort of an emergency fashion. But even in normal times, donors have lots of people coming at them for lots of different reasons. They have their church, they have their college or university, they have social services organizations, whatever they may have been involved. So I think sometimes groups, and I'm guilty of this too, we get into a bubble of the work we're doing and we're passionate about it and we think it's really important. And that's great. You need to be that way about when you're trying to raise money or when you're working for an organization. But just remember that other people aren't doing it every day. So you have to remember to tell that story and keep in mind that there's going to be competition for those dollars. And you have to be real crisp about how you ask and the way you go about it. A couple of things that I hear regularly that I would encourage you to not think about in terms of how to raise money. There's that old statement that, well, if we just get everyone to give $1, or if we just give everybody to give $50, we'll meet our goal. That just doesn't happen. It's been proven time and time again, no matter how important you think your organization is, not everybody's going to give to you. So you're going to want to make sure that you have that, get that philosophy out of your head if you think that. And then the other one that I hear all the time, still to this day, is, the Mrs. Jones is rich. She's got a lot of money. Let's go ask her for money. Well, that's great. Mrs. Jones might have a lot of money, but if she has no interest or involvement in your organization, or you've never ever talked to her before, it's very unlikely that she's going to suddenly support you. Because if you know Mrs. Jones is rich, everybody else in that community knows Mrs. Jones is rich. So they're all asking her for money. So when I talk to people about who should, and they ask who should we be talking to about supporting our group, I always tell people, particularly when it comes to major gifts, make sure it's somebody that has some kind of connection to your organization. We sometimes call this the Bill Gates theory. When all big organizations always want to go solicit Bill Gates because he's got billions of dollars, but everybody else knows that he's got billions of dollars too. So unlikely that you're going to get a gift from him. And then, just a word about what's going on right now. I'm working with a lot of groups right now that are trying to deal with this. And the thing that I tell people is, look, you have to acknowledge that it's going on. Obviously, in your world, in Parks and Rec, it has probably an even deeper impact. But I would not let it deter you from your fundraising. You have to mention it, talk about it. But, and I think I talked to Dan about this a little bit. Like, I think in a lot of ways, Parks and Recs groups have an even stronger case now for fundraising, given what we've just come out of, people locked up for 3 months, and what some of the recommendations are from the various health organizations about getting outside and doing things and being active. I think you have an even stronger case, and don't be afraid to make that case. I mean, the groups that I see right now that are successful during this time are the ones that can offer a solution to some of the problems that we're having and some of the ways out of it. So again, don't be shy about it. I deal with a lot of groups that are really cautious about raising money, and some groups that have said, well, we can't raise money now. You should never say that. My general philosophy is let the donors decide. You make your case. If you have a good, compelling case, let the donors figure out whether they want to support you or not. And again, like I said before, the basics of fundraising still apply. You got to have a good communications program. You got to ask people regularly. You got to do all the things you did before. But my main point would be, don't let it deter you, and think of it as an opportunity to make an even stronger case for the work that you guys do in the community, particularly given some of the financial stress you're going to be facing. So let me talk a little bit more specifically about what I mean when I talk about communications and outreach, and particularly as it relates to donors or to potential donors. I think the main point is you want to be consistent with your message in terms of how often you deliver and when you deliver, and you want to make sure that you continue to offer fresh content to people. One thing that the mistake I see from groups is, maybe they'll do an email 1 month and then skip 3 months and another month, or maybe they'll have a website and they'll, not really update it. So people will go back to that website and there won't be fresh content on there. So they'll stop going back. So, given the work you do and the fact that you've got kids running around in programs and you got volunteers, there should always be fresh content. So for sure, make sure that you continue to update things. I recommend multiple channels when it comes to communication. So hopefully you've got some email addresses in your database that you can use. Typically, I recommend some sort of e-letter that goes out to people in an email. Obviously, there's all sorts of social media things you can do. Facebook probably still the most popular, particularly from a fundraising perspective in terms of the audience that you're trying to get to. And then, of course, I assume everybody has a website, but you want to make sure that that website has some talk of donation, of fundraising, and how you can contribute. And again, keeping it fresh, keeping communications up there. And remember, not every communications piece has to talk about giving money or has to be a solicitation. It's perfectly fine and strongly encouraged to just communicate with your donors, prospective donors, regularly about what's going on. You don't always have to ask them for money. In fact, I would discourage you from always asking for money. You don't want every point of contact with your prospective donors to be a solicitation. I'm still a big believer in printed newsletters. The pendulum has swung a little bit. I think maybe 8 or 10 years ago, people were getting away from printed solicitations and printed mailings because there was so much in the mail. But I think we've kind of gone the other way now. There's so much in email that things kind of get lost. So I strongly encourage groups to put together some sort of printed newsletter and get it mailed out to people. And frankly, the audience that you're talking to in terms of prospective donors is a little older, and they're still reading things. So we are finding with a lot of the groups that I work with that there's kind of a shift back to print. And from a fundraising perspective, it's actually a little more successful. I would encourage you to do some sort of communications outreach with your prospective donors at least once a month, whether that be, like I said, an email or a newsletter. Really probably 18 to 20 times a year is kind of the ideal. There's that old advertising belief that people have to see something 7 to 10 times before it sinks in. I think that's true. And probably even more so in today's world with the amount of information that's going out to people through social media and email and how easy it is to communicate it. It's even more important to communicate with people regularly so they at some point see your message and understand what you're getting at. Now, again, hopefully, Parks and Rec has an advantage because people have their kids involved, but it's always good to try to reinforce that sort of message to people. As I said, I always encourage people to tell stories. We always use people when we talk about, if we're trying to get a message across, we always pick out individuals that are involved in that program and we tell a story about that particular person. And I love pictures. You want to get as many pictures in your communications as possible, particularly of kids. There's that old line, I think, from Broadway that says you never want to follow kids and animals. And I think that's really true in fundraising to some degree. If you can tell people or show people that you're really helping youth and making their lives better and offering them opportunities, I think that's a really compelling story. And picture does tell 1,000 words, particularly in fundraising. So, one thing people ask a lot is, how long should I be doing this? And of course, it's always possible that you can skip this stage and jump right into annual fund or a capital campaign. I would strongly discourage that. I realize sometimes that circumstances require you to skip those things, but it just makes it a lot harder. So I would say at a minimum, if you're talking about doing some fundraising, that you'd want to have year and a half of a communication strategy in place. Ideally, 3+ years. But again, The important point is, if you are not doing any kinds of communications right now, to start it as quick as possible. And if you are doing it, to maybe follow some of these steps, because again, the more you communicate with people, the more you tell that story, the easier it's going to be when you make the case to them that, hey, we need some extra money for this project, or just in terms of trying to raise money on an annual basis. Questions? Any questions, Dan? Nope, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't have any in my chat box.
Okay, good.
But I've encouraged people to either put it in the chat box or unmute yourself.
So just give me a sign when you have some.
Okay, I will. I'll do it.
Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about some basics of annual fund, annual appeal type work. And again, I don't mean to give you a total roadmap for how this works. This is just kind of a general broad stroke of some things that you should be thinking about. So again, for those of you, some of you may be already doing an annual fund. If you're not, annual fund, annual appeals tend to be money that's raised for kind of the general needs of the organization on an annual basis. Hopefully generally unrestricted money, although it is possible to have a specific purpose or ask for a specific purpose when it comes to annual fund. I would still encourage you, though, to use this annual fund money for kind of exciting stuff that you're doing, new things that you're doing, because again, back to the communications piece of it. When you go back to donors, you want to be able to tell the story of how you use their money. And it's certainly much better to talk about a program that you started, or how you were able to pay for some kids who wouldn't normally be able to take part in your programs, or how you bought a piece of equipment and it helps you get X number of kids participated. And again, it's a very specific group, because part of what you're trying to do is give people the sense that their money's being used for something interesting and they're going to want to keep giving. So to the extent that you can, tell interesting, exciting stories about how you're using the annual fund money, the better off it's going to be down the road. Usually we talk about annual fund, smaller size gifts, $10, $25, $100, depending on the size of the organization. That's kind of what we're thinking about when we're making annual fund appeal asks, because you typically put some sort of specific request in the solicitation. Still, I'm a big believer, as I've already said, in direct mail. It works. It's something that you should, seriously consider doing if you're not already doing. There's obviously some costs up front in finding addresses and figuring out who you are if you don't already have a donor base built. But I would encourage that at least part of your annual appeal be done through a direct mail, through a printed piece. Obviously, email solicitations are easy to do. For those of you that have databases with emails in them, I would encourage you to continue to grow that the best you can. But again, just like anything, even back to what we talked about, our communication strategy, different people pay attention to different kinds of communications / solicitations. So there are some people that are only going to respond to direct mail, particularly the older crowd. And then there are people that only respond to email. So you're trying to hit different people in different ways that allows that they're most likely to respond to. There's always that big question of what's the appropriate number of solicitations throughout a year. Again, there's no sort of scientific answer to this. I've always been comfortable with, 4, 5, 6 actual hardcore solicitations throughout the year, whether it be direct mail or through email. Again, depends a little bit on the size of your database, but obviously if you're a smaller organization, you're going to have a smaller database. You don't want to be hammering people every month. I think you do, but you do want to give people various opportunities throughout the year to actually make a gift. Because again, everybody's on a little different timeline. Some people give at the end of the year. Some people give at the beginning of the year, the middle. You just want to try to hit people whenever you can. And again, in terms of prepping for a capital campaign, the annual fund is where you are building your prospect pool for future major gifts. Obviously, the best indicator of a person who is going to support your organization is somebody who has already supported your organization. So part of the objective of building a strong annual program is to build a strong pool of prospects for future major gifts. So that's why, again, part of this progression of working from up to a capital campaign is to do the communications, do the annual fund, build your pool, and then be able to find that pool of people. Because I'll talk in a minute about the number of people that's required to to get to that point. So again, just to give you a sense for those of you that maybe aren't doing this, if you're going to start an annual fund program, or even if you have one and you want to do some what we call prospecting, for example, you might do 1,000-piece mailing, might cost you, $1.50 a piece to mail it. So $1,500. A typical return on a prospect mailing is 1% to 2%. Counting on the fact that you guys are already in the community, people probably know at least who you are. It might give you a little bit better return. $50, $40, $50, $60 average gift is kind of standard. So from that mailing, you might get 20 gifts for $500, give you $1,000. You're probably going to lose money on prospect mailings, but the whole point is that you've acquired 20 donors. And over time, as you build that donor base, then you get to the point where you actually do donor mailings, and here's kind of what you might expect from a standard, donor mailing, where you get a little better return, obviously, actually a lot better return, because these are people that have already shown that they're going to give to you, and the higher average gift, again, because they're supportive of you. So you're going to make it a little bit more money, so you can see the difference. So even though that initial prospect mailing cost you some money down the road, now you're talking about making money. And again, on top of that, you're building that pool of prospective major donors. So again, you can see why it's really important to invest a little bit of money in these things. Sometimes people get caught up in the fact that prospecting costs money and you're going to lose money, but you just have to be realistic about that, because the biggest mistake you can make, and I've seen this with lots of organizations, is to do the prospecting and then somebody comes along and says, oh, we're losing money, we have to stop doing that. But really what you are mostly concerned about is the future value of those donors that you acquire. It's donors typically you'll be able to retain 40, 50, 60% of them, and their lifetime value will be significant. So you have to be willing to kind of spend that money up front. And that goes to what I talked about before in terms of having to follow some steps and being willing to continue to invest in them. Again, these are just some samples. Lots of different places will have different results, but it's kind of a good sense of what that might look like for organizations like yours. So I want to talk a little bit about, how you get into a capital campaign. Any questions, Dan? Questions? Nope.
No. Yeah, we do,
Okay.
actually.
Okay.
Let's see. Gwyneth asks, what information data do you recommend be kept in a spreadsheet to track donors and their donations?
Sure. Well, I would encourage groups to have some sort of fundraising platform that you can use. There are a lot of groups, there are a lot of companies that offer either free or really inexpensive donor software. Most of them now are online platforms, so you don't actually have to download the software. And really, for the purposes that we're talking about here, obviously name, address, phone number, if you can get an email address, that's great. Try and build that up. And then just giving history. Really, for the work that you all are doing, that's probably good enough. For some of the more sophisticated organizations in there, there's all sorts of information you can get that costs money. Knowing that you're all at sort of a similar kind of watching your budget, I would say find one of these online companies that has a good deal for smaller organizations. And if you can just keep those bits of information in the database, that'll go a long way toward allowing you to continue to do these things.
Okay, good. And we have a question from Brian. Is it recommended to avoid holiday seasons, or is that an appropriate time to ask?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's actually a really good question. The reason I'm laughing is because the organizations have gotten earlier and earlier with their Christmas solicitation. Obviously, it is a good time to ask.
So have the stores.
Yeah, that's right. It's track the stores. It's a good time to ask. A lot of people do make their gifts toward the end of the year. So it used to be like mid-December, and then it got back to early December, and now there are groups that come out with their sort of holiday-esque in mid-November. So yeah, no, for sure, don't avoid the holidays. You're trying to find a slot in there where maybe you can not have to compete with everybody else. That's really hard to do these days because there's just so many groups that solicit at that time. But that kind of goes back to what I said before about having that consistent plan for when you solicit people, when you communicate with them, so that you are not relying on any one particular campaign to make it for the year. you really want to try to map things out so that you're doing it throughout the course of the year. And that people can kind of give when they give and they have multiple opportunities. But no, I for sure wouldn't avoid any particular times. Because the other one is people say, oh, don't ask during the summer. People are on vacation. No, that's not really true either. I mean, you could basically get to the point where you never ask throughout the course of the year if you're looking for excuses to not ask for money. So again, like I said, have a good solid plan, follow it, and let the donors decide when they want to give to you.
Okay, we have another question here, and I'll try to summarize it. They had a summer camp, but they canceled the summer camp, but they really didn't have any expenses because they canceled the summer camp. But they're hoping to do something to substitute for that summer camp, but they don't have any income to support it. So they were wondering, is it proper to ask like a store and how to advertise a fundraiser, and how could they get that funded? I think can you go for corporate sponsorship or something?
It's a little hard. It kind of depends on what you're looking for. I would stay away from stores for the foreseeable future. There's not going to be a lot of money.
Not to interrupt, but that's not exactly what I meant.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Courtney.
So it's a retail store, Five Below. They run fundraisers through their store. So we would just be utilizing them to offer a fundraiser. So pretty much members of the playground who have used it in the past, they would take a coupon to Five Below, and a portion of their purchase would come back to us. But my question really is how can I justify running a fundraiser with playground being closed? Our hope is to have some pop-up events. So really we would need the income from the fundraiser in order to do the pop-up events. But if something would fall through with the pop-up event, how else could I be justifying this fundraiser? I mean, for future years, for repairs, in hopes that we can do a pop-up event, like what would be a safe route?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably just, again, go direct to donors with that and make the case that, hey, here's what we're trying to do. Here's why we think we're going to need the money. I don't know that I would try to complicate it by doing the store fundraising thing. I'd rather just have people know what you're trying to do and have them give to you directly.
So you're just saying ask people for money rather than try and raise it yourself? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise it ourselves by utilizing a fundraising program.
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on where you are with your current fundraising program. Like if you have an active program that you can go to donors and ask them, or if you're talking about starting something completely new, then that's a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
Yeah, you can catch up afterwards too, Courtney, if you want to call me.
Okay.
It depends a little bit on where you are.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Thank you.
Yep.
And thank you, Courtney, for straightening out that question for me. That was helpful.
Sure, no problem.
That's it, right, for right now.
Okay, sure. So I just want to talk a little bit about how you might get going with a capital campaign. And I have these kind of in reverse order, but they're to some degree one and the same, and important to do both, particularly the feasibility study aspect of a capital campaign. One of the most common calls that I get from people is, hey, we started this capital campaign. It's not going well. Can you help us? And I always ask, well, did you do a feasibility study? And 99 times out of 100, the answer is no, we didn't do a feasibility study, which that's a huge problem. And I'll explain about all that in a minute. But, part of doing a capital campaign is, no matter where you are in your fundraising program, is doing some sort of feasibility study to have a sense of what you can actually do. So when I talk about capital campaigns, we're talking about something that's got a defined timeline, and it's really for a specific project. In your case, maybe you want to buy some park equipment, maybe you want to build a new facility, something related to building something or growing something. You can do it for programs. It's a little less compelling to do that, but it just kind of depends on where you are as an organization and what kind of relationships you have with your donors. Feasibility study is actually done first as a part of the campaign. And again, I cannot emphasize to you the importance of doing some kind of feasibility study. This is a time where you will meet with prospective, individuals and corporations who could be major donors. You're really trying to get a feel for them. What do they think of the project? Will they support it? To what level to what level would they consider supporting it? Because you really want to be able to have that data before you open up start talking publicly about the capital campaign. Because ultimately the objective here is to be successful. And the worst case scenario, frankly, is to roll out a big capital campaign for, say, $500,000 and then not get anywhere close to that. So you really want to avoid that scenario in any situation. So part of what we try to do when we talk with people about these things is make sure they've done their homework up front. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second about some of the specifics involved in that. And again, you also typically in a feasibility study, you'll do some sort of community survey, a little broader based, just trying to get a sense for what people feel. And again, essentially you're setting them up for the ask. The purpose of some of this is to get buy-in from people early on, so that when it does come time to ask, you really have already sort of laid the groundwork with them. And again, the objective when it comes to these questions are you going to support it? Yes or no? And try to get a sense for what level people were at. And this is really mostly talking about the major donors, because as we'll talk about in a minute, it's really important. Capital campaigns are really driven by the top donors. One tricky part of these things when you do ask for people for input is that you get it from them. And depending on that input, it can be good or bad. So you have to be a little careful about how you manage major donors. Sometimes major donors can be very aggressive about what they think you're doing and how you're doing it. But you just have to make sure that you have a good sense of where you want to be as an organization and what you want that project to look like. And sometimes you might actually have to walk away from some money from a donor who wants to do something that just doesn't really match what you're trying to do. But sometimes too, the donors can give you really good input. So I would, encourage you to seek it and just be prepared that maybe it isn't exactly going to be feasible to do what you want to do.
Well, we have a question.
Sure.
Should you hire a capital campaign leader, company, consultant?
Yeah. If you don't have the staff capable of doing it, then I would encourage you to try to get somebody who could do the feasibility study at a minimum. Because part of it is that you get more objective information if it's a person who isn't necessarily working for the organization. But, again, depending on where you are as an organization and where you are from a financial perspective, those folks can be expensive. So it is possible to do one on your own. And I would always encourage, even if you have counsel, fundraising counsel, to try to do some of these meetings on your own, because as an organization, you want to get to know these donors too. You want to understand them. And that's one thing I'll talk about in this part of it. Part of doing the feasibility study is giving you an opportunity to get to know your donors and establish that relationship. You want to understand what their background is. Did they participate in parks and rec programs when they were a kid? Did their kids participate? Did their grandkids participate? What is it about your organization that really gets them excited? Maybe they're interested in softball fields. Maybe they're interested in programs. Maybe they want to build a new building for you. Whatever it is, it's your opportunity to really get to know a donor, where you're not really, during a feasibility study, you're not technically asking people for money. You're just getting their input. So it's kind of a casual way to get to know people, but it should always be about getting to know those donors. So that question worked nicely into my next slide. Anything else, Dan?
There is another one. Maybe
Sure,
it works at the end of this slide. Is it possible to be provided with a sample feasibility study for guidance?
Sure. Yeah. They're out there. Let me see if I can find one that would be appropriate. There's so many different options out there. Let me see if I can find one and send it along, and you can send it out. Is that fine, Dan? Does that work?
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm sure they would appreciate it.
Yeah. So again, what are you trying to accomplish in these feasibility study meetings? Like I said, obviously you want to get to know the donor. You want to gauge their interest. This is your opportunity to really explain to the prospective donor what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. If you're building something, if you have renderings that you can actually show them, that's obviously very helpful. You want people to begin to visualize exactly what it is you're doing. You really want to talk about the budget. Why do you need this money? Why do you need to raise this money? How are you going to spend the money? Who's going to take care of it? What's going to look like 5, 10 years from now. Because remember, in theory, when you're talking to these prospective major donors, they are very likely successful business people from the community. They spend their days and time talking about budgets and long term. And, someone who's built a successful budget, you want to be able to show them that you have thought this through and you have a plan to make this thing work, not just in the first year, but in the 5 years and 10 years. You want to give them confidence that the money that they contribute to you is going to be spent and used wisely. So this is your chance to do that. This is like your opportunity to really show these prospective donors, hey, we know what we're doing. We thought this through. We talked about this. Here's why we're doing it, and here's how it's going to work. And of course, you always want to be able to talk about how many kids, people will be impacted. If it's something that's new, you can say, hey, we know we have this need. Here's how many other additional people are going to be impacted by this. Or if it's something that you're rebuilding or redoing, you can say, here's the additional things that we can do. But again, even in that case, as I've talked about many times, to the extent that you can make it very specific and say, here's the kinds of kids that we're going to be able to help. Here's how it's going to help parents. Here's how it's going to make people's life better. Because while you're not doing the hard sell yet, you're setting the groundwork for the hard sell. So now's your chance to give people a sense that you know what you're doing and you've thought it through. And really, during the feasibility study, we really asked people straight out, is this a project that you would be willing to support and to make a gift to? And I don't mean support by saying, yeah, I agree with it. We really want to find out from people. And I really stress to people that at this stage, we just want them to be honest. We're really trying to figure out whether this is going to work. And we really want people to be straightforward and honest with us, because we can't make a good decision from the feasibility study unless we get good, honest data from people. So I really, in fact, hammer that point home to say, look, we really want you to be honest. And I'll talk about the gift table in a second. I use a gift table here at this point, and I'll show you that, and we'll go through that. But it really helps people kind of understand where you need to be from a campaign perspective, but more importantly, where they're going to fit in. And it gives you that first set of data that you can use. Also, an opportunity during these meetings to identify what we call centers of influence. If you're in one of these meetings and you're talking to someone and they're getting excited about this and you get a sense that they're really into it, you can really use this as a chance to ask them if they'd be willing to solicit some of their friends. Because obviously, this is a community-based project. A lot of you are in smaller communities. People know each other. If you're talking to somebody who's an influencer, not a social media influencer, a community influencer, and they really get excited about this and they really want to help, then definitely take advantage of that, because among the most successful kinds of asks are the peer-to-peer asks. So if you can find somebody who's really involved in this project, and they're really interested in helping and wants to go help other people, definitely take advantage of that. So here's the gift table I talked about. And again, this is just a sample based on, some of my experience, pretty standard type thing. Let's say you wanted to raise $500,000. This is what it might look like. So first off, when I'm talking with a donor during a feasibility study, I will actually say, here's what we need to raise. Here's what we think we need in terms of the kinds of gifts. Where do you, Mr. and Mrs. Donor, see yourselves? Now, hopefully, prior to this meeting, I have some sense of where they might be, and I'm going to try to steer them into that area. Like if I think it's going to be a lead donor, somebody that can make a lead gift, I'll say, hey, would you see yourself being the lead donor, or maybe somebody at a different level? But you do want to try to get from them some sense of where they might be, so that when you start to compile your data, you have a better sense of what you're going to be able to do. So the other thing I wanted to talk about with this gift table is, as you can see, it's very top heavy. The top 20-ish donors are going to be responsible for, 75, 80% of the gifts. And that's pretty standard in fundraising. If you're talking about raising this kind of money, you need to have some people at these levels, or else it's not going to work. It's really, really hard to raise $500,000 with people giving you $500 or $1,000. So you really need to make sure that as you get into this, you've got this pool of prospects. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before in terms of the numbers game. So, when you think about building the pool of people that you're going to need to have that kind of a successful campaign, hint, hint, this is an important aspect for Dan's quiz. Remember, most of that money is going to come from this top 20%. So when you start to think about it, I use what is kind of the standard rule in actually fundraising and sales, this sort of 10-3-1 rule / guideline. And again, there's some leeway in there, but just think of it in terms of, if you ultimately want to get one major gift, you're going to probably need to have 3 proposals that go out. And in order to get to that 3 proposals, you're going to have probably 10 prospective donors. So when you start thinking of it in those terms, if you need to get, based on that table we just looked at, if you need to get 20 major gifts, you're going to need to have, 150 or 200 major donors, major donor prospects, people that are capable of making that kind of gift. Now, I don't say this to scare you away. Again, it goes back to trying to be honest with yourselves about what this is going to take. And I would also probably argue that, given the kind of organization that you guys are in terms of having a pretty strong footprint in the community, your ratio will probably be a little bit better, because you have some exposure. People kind of know what you do, how you do it. It's a little easier to tell the story. And again, what really helps in these situations, if you have already had and done the steps that we've talked about before in terms of the communications and the annual fund, and you already have a pool of major donors that are familiar with the work you do and have already been making some contributions. So again, you can sort of see what I'm talking about, hopefully anyway, when we talk about the importance of building the foundation and working through a fundraising program to get to these points. Because if you've not done this and you just say, hey, we got to go raise $1 million, it's really, really difficult to be able to identify who these people are and where they're going to come from with all the other things that we're talking about. So again, to do a campaign like that, you're going to probably need, 500,000 total prospects. And again, I would be comfortable saying that it might be a little bit less for groups like yours that already have a pretty strong footprint in the community. But again, just back to that numbers game of what you need to have in the pool to be able to make this successful.
Okay, Paul, I do have a question here for you on the chat box. What about a town park in an area where no one can contribute financially and there are no businesses? Is it okay to campaign for funding from adjoining towns and businesses? Yeah, where could you get funds from, I guess, if you're...
Yeah. Do those people, I guess the question is always, do those people have some stake in that park? Unless people are using it or their kids use it, it's really difficult to go out to major donors and say, hey, can you give some money for something that you're never going to use? So I think that goes back to, thinking about a communication strategy and an annual fund that tells that story to those people. But I'm not going to lie to you, that's really a tough sell, because I've been through that with a couple of groups where they are small communities that either don't have the donors, but they need to do things. It's just really, really hard to make that work.
Thanks, Paul.
Sorry for that pessimistic answer. So just want to talk a little bit about this whole concept of establishing the goal. I think I alluded to this earlier, but one mistake that organizations make regularly is, they have a project and they say, we need to raise $1 million for this project. Let's go raise $1 million without really doing a feasibility study, or frankly, ignoring whatever data they get. So I think this is where some of the art of fundraising comes into play. If you have a project that you need to do that, say, costs $500,000, and you go out and you do a feasibility study, and the most you can raise is, say, $300,000, then you as an organization just have to ask some hard questions and say, okay, is this something that we should be doing right now? Do we have money in the budget to cover that gap? Is there another source where we can find that gap, where we can make up that difference? Or maybe we just need to take another year or two to grow our donor base, or to establish our donor base to get to that point. Because again, the worst thing you can do in fundraising is have a failed capital campaign, is to announce a capital campaign and then either not make your goal and sort of never talk about it again, because people, they see the news, they see these things. And if you're trying to build confidence in donors, the worst thing you can do is announce something and then not have it work, because it just makes the pitch and the sell that much difficult. So maybe you need to adjust it. Maybe you need to adjust the goal. Maybe you need to adjust the time frame, but don't be afraid to do that. Do not be afraid to delay things or to rethink how you're doing it, because again, ultimately the objective through all of this is to have a successful campaign. And again, you all know your budgets and your revenue sources better than I do, but if it's a relatively small gap, maybe there's some other money you can find. I know DCD has some programs. Maybe you can find a little space in your regular budget to help make up the difference. But again, the overarching message here is don't try to push something through where the data is telling you one thing and you're trying to do another thing. Like I said, I've seen this so many times where organizations say, hey, we need to raise 500,000. We did a feasibility study. It only showed 250, but I'm sure we can find that other 250. That's what I call happy talk. That's great, but I've just seen this fail so many times, and organizations find themselves in really desperate situation. You're just so much better off being realistic and saying, nope, we need some more time to prepare. We're just not ready. We're not going to do this until we feel like we're ready. So again, just to kind of reiterate, some of what the capital campaign stages are. And again, I didn't include these here, but frankly, if you really want to have a successful capital campaign, the first two stages would be that communication piece and that annual fund piece. But in addition to that, the absolutely necessary stages are feasibility study. And you want to get your donors involved right away. This is the first opportunity, at least your major donors, to get them involved, to get them to get buy-in. The feasibility study, as we just talked about, also helps you establish the goal. Typically then would go into a quiet phase. And that's a period where you're really securing your major gifts, because, newsflash, sometimes donors change their mind and there can be a gap of a few months in between there. But now's your opportunity to go back to those folks that you spoke to during the feasibility study and say, okay, I talked to you, you said you agreed to this. Would you be willing to commit to this gift now and get some signed pledge forms? The good thing about a quiet phase is it gives you some flexibility in timing and goal, because the next step to a capital campaign is the public announcement. And one of the keys there is that when you do make that public announcement, you really want to have at least 50% of your stated goal. Preferably, 2/3 or even 3/4 if you can get to that. So the quiet phase really gives you that opportunity to internally have kind of a flexible timeline and a flexible goal. Like you typically go into that with what we call kind of a target goal and then a stretch goal, so that if things go maybe not as well as you hope, you can back that down a little bit. Or if they're going really well, you can bump it up a little bit. But it gives you that flexibility, depending on what donors say, to be able to adjust that before you go public. Because again, when you go public, you want to be 90% certain, barring some COVID-like catastrophe, that you're going to be able to get to that goal. Because that's the thing that you don't want to happen, is that failed campaign. So again, when you announce, press release, email, newsletter, sometimes people have an event if it's feasible, if it makes sense. It's always good to get donors together with each other, with staff. So, if you can do that, that makes sense to do that. Oh, and that's also the stage where you do, this sort of community-wide solicitation where you start asking for those lower level gifts and that $1,000, less than, $100, $500 gifts. One other thing that I forgot to mention too, and this is an important piece of this, be prepared to be able to accept and offer to donors pledged gifts. So I typically go with a capital campaign, depending on how quickly you need the money, some sort of 2, 3, 4, or 5 year pledge commitments. So that $100,000 gift that we talked about before, a lot of times it's much more comfortable for people to be able to spread that out over 3 or 4 or 5 years. Again, depending on when exactly you need the money. And that is very, very common. Very rarely do you see a gift from someone of that level that has one time they write a check for that amount. So again, just be prepared to work that in. That'll help you maximize your gifts. And then of course there's some sort of closing celebration, and then you'll be able to do really talk about, hey, what a great organization we are. Thank you, donors. Thank you, community, for supporting us. And that really sets you up for your continued fundraising. Before I give my final thoughts, any questions regarding those last couple of things, Dan?
There's nothing in the chat box, but we can certainly open the mics and go ahead and ask away, folks.
Yeah, let me just, while you guys are thinking about that, let me just, a couple quick final thoughts, not to beat a dead horse here, but again, if you really want to make this stuff work, no shortcuts, need to follow that processes. It's not rocket science. Don't be afraid of it. You just got to figure out how to invest some time and energy and money into it and how to make it work. Really important to build that foundation. As I said, you can try to do an annual fund or a capital campaign without having built that foundation, but absent some angel donors, it's going to be really hard to do that. And again, I've said it 50 times already, but just try to be realistic. It's really hard. As I said, you're passionate about your organization. You want it to work. You want people to believe in it the way you do. And you can hopefully sell that emotion and sell that passion, but you just need to make sure you're pragmatic about what that means in terms of how you raise money. Okay.
There is a question here. Any suggestions for donor recognitions?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always tried to do, particularly when I was at Penn State and even now doing some work with the local high school, is try to get donors connected with the people who are benefiting from their gifts as easy as possible. And in this case, you know, to the extent that you can get donors to meet with families or kids and really get to show donors how this is benefiting, you know, the people, your constituency, I think that's really valuable. Now, if you can't actually get them together in the same room, you know, tell very specific stories to your donors about how those things are doing, and show them that that's really helpful. So a donor recognition thing would be to say, hey, we're going to have a dinner, or we're going to have a lunch, or we're just going to have a cocktail party. We're going to have all our donors here. We're going to recognize them. We're going to have some kids here. You know, that's kind of the most emotional human touch you can do to things. You know, a lot of the other standard things, you know, talk about naming things or having donor clubs, those things are all helpful. But the most powerful that you can do is to try to connect people physically in some way, even if it's something like getting kids to write thank you notes. That's really powerful too.
Is swag more appropriate for the annual fund or for major gifts and donors?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about swag. Sometimes donors, especially particularly for smallish organizations, they get a little offended by the swag concept, just because they think, hey, don't spend that money on me, spend it on, you know, things that you need. So I would be much more a proponent of doing little things like I talked about, like thank you notes, you know, even just calls from the executive director, just little tiny personal touches like that I think are more effective with a donor than sending them a keychain or a cup or something like that. Anything else, Dan? I think I covered all the quiz questions. I hope I did anyway. Dan, I think you're muted, Dan.
So you just missed all my thank yous to you, Paul.
That's okay. I know you believe that. And so, I would thank everyone for being here. I hope you learned something. If you have specific questions about anything, shoot me an email, send me a call. I'm always happy to, or call me. I'm always happy to talk with folks about their individual situations.
So let's go to the next slide here. Special thanks to Paul Olivett, Executive Director of State College Area Education Foundation, for his presentation. You can reach Paul, and his email address is paulo@baronpublishing.com, or even his phone number there if you want to have a quick chat. Paul is a consultant, a fundraising consultant, so it might be worth your time. This webinar has been approved for 0.1 CEU, 1 contact hours. I'm going to put a poll up, which will have 5 questions. Please answer those questions if you're interested in getting CEU. And Paul, can you help me? Do you see the poll?
Yes, I do see the poll. It's up
All
there.
right. So go ahead and answer those 5 questions and then submit your poll. After successfully passing the quiz, a notice